Hi, I'm Bill Crystal. Welcome back to Conversations. I'm very pleased to be joined again by Jason Furman, professor of economics at Harvard, teaches the key Introduction to Economics course there, Ec 10, head of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Obama. Lots of experience in Washington, lots of experience in thinking about economic policy and explaining it clearly and cogently, as he has done on several conversations with me. So, Jason, thanks very much for joining me again.
Thanks for having me again.
Our last conversation, I think, was in June, and we discussed the soft landing, which seems to have happened softly and pretty successfully. But I think today what would be helpful to people, it's Tuesday, what is it, October 8th, 4 weeks out from the election, is to talk about the contrasting economic plans and policies of the two candidates. So we can talk about how much of them will actually go into effect. But they are, for all the talk that there hasn't been that much policy in this campaign, which may be true compared to some other earlier campaigns, they have laid out economic plans that are pretty distinct, haven't they, Jason?
Oh, yeah, they definitely have laid out plans. Hers is more specific than his. And, broadly speaking, I'd characterize the Harris approach as if she's president, you're going to get less of the same. It's going to be like Biden, but a bit less in a number of dimensions. A bit less in part because you don't have the context of the pandemic, which led to this huge response. A bit less because there was even some being burned by some of the larger things. The Senate is 2/3 chance of being Republican if she's elected president. And finally, I think her instincts are just a little bit more towards wanting to pal around with CEOs than labor leaders relative to Joe Biden. So for her, the overall approach to me seems pretty clear. For Trump, in many respects, it is less clear. He's enormously erratic. He changes his mind on lots and lots of things. And there's one Trump of responsible advisors who doesn't do anything he says on the campaign and things turn out basically fine. There's another Trump who does follow through on everything he said in the campaign. And that could be a pretty large downside for growth and a large downside, in terms of higher inflation. And I think the worry is that two of the things that Trump is most attached to, immigration and trade, are two of the ones where there's almost an unambiguous answer as to the macro impact.
I mean, I have the sense in other spheres like foreign policy that unlike his first term, where he was, at least for the first 2 or 3 years, checked by fairly conventional establishment Republicans in key positions, certainly in foreign policy, to some degree in economics, I suppose, with Gary Cohn and others, and Powell, the Fed chair, that the second term will be more Trumpy. I mean, he learned some lessons. J.D. Vance is much more committed, I would say, to ensuring that we have an America First, Project 2025 type administration. Do you feel that that's the case in economics, that the kind of the mainstream side of the equation diminishes some and the Trump-specific priorities are more likely to be enacted or attempt to be enacted?
Yeah, I think that is the most likely scenario here. There are three things that have shifted from his first term that I see. One is just his own attitude of let Trump be Trump. Not going to make the mistake of appointing people to constrain me. And the shift from Gary Cohn to Larry Kudlow is a very large one. And I actually like Larry Kudlow a lot. He's a terrific guy, but he was not a huge constraint on Trump. And you saw that in, for example, the people that Trump either nominated or said he was going to nominate to the Fed towards the end of his term were very, very different and much, much worse than the people he had at the beginning of the term. So I think that's the first change, is what type of White House and administration you'll have. The second is the Congress. It is much more of a MAGA Congress than it was during the first time he was president. Would be more enthusiastic and less of a constraint on it. And the third is at the level of ideas. I think the intellectual support for Trumpism is still quite weak, and I'm not sure you could make a strong, overly coherent version, but there's much more of an effort to do it now than there was 8 years ago. I mean, I'm struck that I can go on CNBC and they will find people from the Heritage Foundation to argue that replacing the income tax with tariffs is a good idea. I mean, that is not something that there's any economist in the universe anywhere in the political spectrum that would think was a good idea. But Heritage is out there, Oren Cass is out there. So there's more, I don't know how much it matters, but there are more of a set of people saying, actually, this is a good idea than was the case 8 years ago.
Yeah, Heritage would not have said it was a good idea 8 years ago. To be, and it's a big, I think that's a very important point that I think some people underestimate because they still live in a world where there's the establishment of Brookings and AEI and, Harvard's economics department and so forth. And there's a big infrastructure. There's a big MAGA infrastructure, which includes a policy infrastructure. You and I might not think highly of those policies or, think that they're being somewhat disingenuously promoted or based on bad analysis, but they are there. It's not as if he's not going to have the notion that he's not going to have anyone to staff his administration is not correct, I think,
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think that is just, again, a change from when he walked in the door 8 years ago.
So
and
you mentioned tariffs.
he's running a campaign, by the way, he is not very disciplined, but the campaign itself is well run and well managed and well disciplined, at least compared to 2016. And so in some respects, I think his White House might actually be able to get more done than, he did when he was president.
I really think that's where the separate issue in a way, but where the selection of Vance as the vice presidential nominee really changes the dynamics. He will view his role, I'm pretty confident, as kind of enforcing a kind of discipline that wasn't enforced in the first term and a kind of, as I said, Project 2025, America First type of enforcing the agenda and the people who would carry out that agenda. And then there's an infrastructure to help him do that. It would be a more radical, maybe is the right word. I don't know, more ideological administration, I suppose, than the first term would be. Well, you mentioned tariffs. Maybe why don't we begin with that? It's not always, I wouldn't say trade is normally the lead issue of contrasting different economic policies, but in fact, probably have a ton of economics, had a lot of bipartisan consensus on trade for decades and decades, but not with Trump, right? And so he's really talked a fair amount about his tariff proposal. I mean, what is the proposal? Could he get it done? How much effect would it have on the economy as a whole?
Yeah, no, I think this is a good one to start with because first of all, while Trump over the years has changed his mind on lots of things, this is one where he has been very, very consistent in his views. And second, in the United States, the president has just an enormous amount of latitude to set tariffs, which is amazing because it's basically a tax. And the Constitution is actually explicit about a tax, not just Congress as a whole, but even who has to initiate the legislation, which is the House of Representatives. But with tariffs, just a lot of that authority has been delegated to the president. He originally proposed a 10% across the board tariff plus a 60% tariff on China. That met a lot of criticism for example, raising costs for a middle class family by $1,700, even more as on a percentage basis for low and moderate income households, and hurting growth, raising inflation, etc. In response to the criticism, Trump is now talking about it might be 20%. He's literally doubling down on the original proposal and has layered on additional ones, reciprocal tariffs, 100% tariffs if you don't use the dollar. And I can't remember if it was maybe even $200% tariffs for John Deere, something like that for companies. He doesn't like. Let's break the two parts apart, the China part and the rest of the world. The rest of the world, I think, is pretty straightforward. A lot of our trade is with countries we're closely allied to. You're talking about Australia, Canada, Germany. In some of these cases, like Australia and Canada, we have free trade agreements that we would be violating. In others, like Germany, we may not have an agreement, but they're a close ally of us. Moreover, those tariffs would be on everything. It would be on consumer goods that we don't make here in the United States and don't have a plan to make and have nothing to do with national security, like ballpoint pens. It would also be on intermediate inputs to manufacturing that would make it much harder to be competitive because half of what we import is not a final good. It's going into the production process itself. And so this across the board tariff has almost no justification. What exactly are we negotiating? What's our complaint? These are countries that on average have tariffs of, something like 2-3% against the United States. And now we'd have 20% against them. Now let's take the China part.
Just on the general tariff for a second. So that would increase the cost of these goods. I mean, just by definition, right? That's what a tariff would do, unless, I guess, stores in the U.S. swallowed a 10%, reduction in their margin, which seems unlikely. But would that be the whole effect, or would it also would it have a knock-on effect on the prices on goods made here?
Yeah, no, it very much would have the direct effect, which is the obvious one that you just said. And then it would have a knock-on effect because for the half of it that's intermediate inputs, you're not going out and buying machinery or steel or whatever, but you're buying things that are made of that. And so that part of the tariff will show up in higher costs. Moreover, it'll make it inefficient to produce in the United States. The history of this isn't just that it shrinks imports, which, by the way, shrinking imports is a bad thing because we love imports. We every day go out and buy things that are made around the world because it's terrific. We'd be much, much poorer if we tried to make everything in the United States. But it doesn't just shrink imports, it also shrinks exports. And the way the economics of it works is you divert resources from to make the imports that you're no longer importing, and those often come out of the exporting sector. So we're losing jobs in exports. We're losing consumer benefits in imports. GDP is going down. Inflation is going up. And then the Fed is sitting there not really knowing what to do because GDP down, they want to cut rates. Inflation up, they want to raise rates. Is it going to be permanent or temporary change in inflation? Well, it depends on how it gets embedded in expectations. I would expect all of that would shake out with higher interest rates as a result of the temporarily higher burst of inflation, and those higher interest rates would themselves have a knock-on effect on things like the housing sector.
And this doesn't even include, just to take one more minute on the general tariffs, the fact that other countries might reciprocate. I mean, I think people sometimes say to me, not that I'm an economist, but talking a little bit, the tariffs thing is serious and people should focus on it. And it may not happen. And I mean, trade's not a huge percentage of the economy. So if some prices go up 10% on the, I don't know, what is it, 10, 15% of goods that we buy that are imported, I guess it's hard to measure because there's intermediate stages and so forth. But I mean, we can live with it. But I mean, I think one reason people get a little freaked out about it is we have some history of raising tariffs and then the other country raising its tariffs, and that hasn't worked out very well. Is that right?
Yeah. As I said, the main thing economically is you get less exports, less imports. That's without any retaliation. When you get retaliation, you get that effect even more. And it's a profoundly naive view of the world to think the United States can just do whatever it wants. Without any expectation of retaliation. And we also I don't think we fully understand. We're an incredibly important economy, but the majority of the world's countries, the majority of their trade is with China, not with the United States. China is a more important trade partner for most of the world. And that further, reduces the amount of leverage we have. And we have to be, realistic about that and understand that.
And presumably, if a geopolitical point of view, you're driving countries into a closer relationship with China and a less close relationship with the United States, which presumably isn't good.
Yeah, look, I mean, India, they're an important ally for the United States in many, many respects, both economically and geopolitically. They're hoping part of their strategy is to capitalize on the U.S.-China trade tensions to have more production shifting to India. And now all of a sudden we're going to shut that down. I don't think Modi is going to be quite as wonderful a friend to the United States in that world. And that's not something you can measure in GDP and inflation and model out and calculate, like the $1,700 cost for middle class families. But it's just as certain.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And on China, there's some case is there a case for some specific tariffs. I mean, Biden has kept some or imposed some, and there's, I guess, arguments for, well, I'll let you explain. I mean,
Yeah. Look, I think China is a different story. There are a set of issues and challenges that China poses to the United States and the world. Don't think you can say the only issue is let's take advantage of gains from trade and ignore everything else that's going on. But I think this administration has actually gotten it right rhetorically, even though I don't always agree with the implementation of it, which is you need to have a small yard and a high fence. What does that mean, a small yard? Things that are important for national security. Microchips. We're going to be really tough on investment into Chinese microchip factories, giving them some of the crucial things they need to build their own microchip supply chain. I'm under no illusion that is not good for us economically. That is not helping our economic growth. But it is a cost that is worth paying, just like sanctions on Russia are not helping American growth. They're not a very big cost, the sanctions on Russia, but they're a small cost that is worth paying. Where I think the Trump approach goes awry is we have nothing to fear from toasters or washing machines or toys or any of that made in China. And we do benefit from trade in those. I think geopolitically, if the U.S. strategy looks like it's about China becoming poorer, that's not going to work out that well. By the way, if we make China poorer and make ourselves poorer, it's not even clear what we do to the relative power that the two have. And we can have a plausible shot at getting the world to work together with us on a legitimate set of issues around China. We've gotten the Netherlands, for example, to join in on microchips, Japan as well. We can't get the world to join in with us on an across-the-board punishment for China with the goal of getting China to buy more American products. I mean, you're not going to get Japan going to China and say, the thing you need to do is get more soybeans and airplanes from the United States. So we need to keep our China list principled, focused on national security, and do it together with our allies rather than be indiscriminately attacking both allies and every single sector in China.
And I guess Trump could respond, well, this is bargaining, Jason. You don't understand this. This is how you have to start off at this number, and then they'll open up their market. But what exactly is the thing Trump wants to get from China that would allow him to go from 60% down to 10%?
Look, in the first term, he got a wonderful agreement for them to buy more stuff with only two problems. One, they didn't buy the more stuff. And so the agreement didn't work. And two, even if they had, it would have been probably just reshuffling the deck chairs. They'd buy something, we used to sell soybeans to Europe and Brazil sold soybeans to China. Now China buys our soybeans, Europe buys Brazil's soybeans, and the whole trade every which way nets out to the same thing. So that was what he tried to accomplish in the first term. I don't think it was a goal that made sense, and it was not a goal that succeeded. And then you go back to the worldwide tariffs. What exactly are we trying to get from Australia, New Zealand through these tariffs? What are we negotiating? I have no idea. And by the way, they've said repeatedly that these tariffs are paid by foreigners, which is not true. They've said it repeatedly. If you believe that, why would you, why wouldn't you want to have them? And by the way, are we going to end up with exceptions? Is it going to be 20% on every single product in every single country? Probably not. But is half of that, if it's only on half of our trade, that's pretty bad. And if I had to choose between a tariff on final goods, which hurts consumers, or a tariff on intermediate inputs, which hurts producers, I'm not even sure which one I think is worse. They're both pretty bad.
I do feel like, I was in government, in 89, White House in 89 to 93, and Vice President Quayle, being a vice president gets a lot of the less exciting foreign policy assignments. So we had many trips to Asia and to Japan to try to badger them to reduce trade barriers, tariffs, but also, non-tariff barriers that they blocked auto imports and auto parts. I remember hearing more talk about auto parts than I thought I'd ever. I managed, thank God, to have the U.S. Chief of Staff, but had the U.S. Trade Representative Carla Hills brief the Vice President and let them work let them decide on their strategy, and I just made sure the meeting took place at the right time in the right place. But I mean, I guess I wonder if in Trump's generation almost it was like that was a problem, and it was kind of a real problem, right? Australia didn't let in some of our, I think, agricultural goods or something, and and tariffs was kind of a way to bargain, but that's not. I feel like I haven't really followed it honestly, but I mean that's not quite the world we live in now, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a few things. First of all, something like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Obama negotiated, Trump killed, and Biden has zippo interest in reviving. Under that, there were larger tariff reductions overseas than there were in the United States, for the simple reason that countries that were in that agreement, like Vietnam, they had much higher tariffs than the United States had, so they were lowering them much more. And by the way, that actually helped Vietnam even more than it helped the United States. They actually suffer because of a bunch of those. For agricultural markets, TPP would have been a huge opening to Japan. So generally, the successful way to open these markets historically had been we offer something in exchange for them opening them. And by the way, because we're more open than they are, we are offering them in some sense less than they're offering. As I said, who benefits from the concessions isn't always obvious. The person making the concession often benefits from it. So that was more the historical model. The other thing is, and this is a tricky issue, it's not completely obvious. Europe has put tariffs on electric vehicles, just like the United States has. With Europe, the end game looks like they want more Chinese factories making EVs in Europe. That does not look like the American end game. That, of course, was the end game for the Japanese car companies. A lot of where it ended up, and I don't know how much was planned in advance as a strategy or not, was we don't want to buy all your cars. Oh, wait, but if you want to make them here in the United States, that's a different story. For EVs, there's a lot of nervousness about Chinese FDI in the United States, and I think there's good reason for that nervousness. But they know a lot of things we don't know. This is not the world of 20 years ago when the United States could spread its knowledge by investing all over the world. This is a world where they are much better than us at making electric vehicles. They are much smarter than us about solar panels. If they open factories in the United States, it's not just jobs for our workers. We're inevitably going to learn a certain amount from them as well. So I think an attitude that is more open to foreign direct investment is something that we need, especially in places where we're behind, and we're behind in those places.
Yeah, that's interesting. And finally, on Harris, you'd mentioned briefly Biden had, do you think Harris would continue sort of Biden's policies, and how would you describe those policies? Sort of free trade-ish, but certainly no enthusiasm, as you say, for reviving TPP, and he didn't remove some of the Trump tariffs and so forth.
Yeah, no, I think the less of the same works here. It probably doesn't work in every area, but this is one of the ones where it does. They kept the Trump tariffs in place. I don't think anyone in the administration really liked them, but they didn't want the political accusations of why did you get rid of them? Why were you soft on China? So I would expect, and then they added some more as well. I think about $18 billion of imports. So I would expect more of a continued focus on China, continuing targeting certain sections and sectors of China, but nothing more broad or general that liberalizes trade, and nothing more broad or general that restricts trade.
When I was in Europe in 2023, trying to do some stuff to help indirectly to help Ukraine, or help them help Ukraine, really coordinate a little bit informally, they complained about some of the tariffs that had been left in place that were against the EU, which who were our allies and whose economies we wanted to flourish, so they could do more to build up their defense industries and help Ukraine more. And I guess Biden left those in place, some of them too.
He left some of them in place, which I haven't been thrilled with.
But the total amount,
they're not like waking up trying to figure out what can we do to place more tariffs on the world. When they put new things on, it's been a careful, deliberative process. Whether they got the cost benefit right in every case, I'm not sure, but they were thinking about costs and benefits and thinking about what the size of the yard should be, how to build the fence.
So all in all, if Harris continues the Biden policies and Trump goes ahead with a good chunk of what he says he wants to do, that's a pretty big contrast. I mean, that's really more of a contrast than we've seen, I guess, in modern times in terms of trade policy, no?
Yeah. And I think the issue is there's both the probability that it happens times the consequence of it happening. And it's quite high in both domains, both the probability side and the consequence side.
Yeah, I feel like people have an internal, and maybe you talk to more business types than I do, certainly, and CNBC types. I feel like people haven't internalized that. They just sort of assume, well, it's going to be like the last time, and there'll be a Gary Cohn to say, wait a second, and Trump will bluster, and then stuff will, as you said, there'll be some fake trade deal with China, which they won't really do much, but it sort of takes the air out of a lot of it, but I don't know. That seems like a pretty big, don't you think, in February of 2025, you could have a pretty big change in U.S. economic policy, right?
Yeah. Oh, yes. There's a chance that's right. I would put the chance that that's right at well below 50%. If somebody wants to argue it's 70.
Which chance is right?
Sorry. There is a chance that he will end up with some much, much smaller thing than what he's proposing. First of all, there's no chance it ends up with nothing. It's going to be something. And I think almost anything in this space is harmful. But there's a chance, maybe 20% that he was lying all along and walks away from all of this. But an 80% chance of a quite bad thing happening is pretty bad. If you think that I'm overly negative about him and you want to make it a 30% chance of a very bad thing happening, well, I wouldn't take that either. There's not really a well-accepted definition of the word tail risk, but tail risks are usually things that are like 2% or 0.2% or 0.02%. This is not a tail risk. This is much, much bigger than anything that we would use the term tail risk for.
And free trade members of Congress, including of his own party, don't really have a chance to stop much of this.
I mean, if Congress wanted to pass a law and override a veto, they could stop it. But I don't think you have.
But under the current, I
can't imagine. No, they have little ability and little appetite. They do not need. He does not need Congress to pass it. And it's inconceivable that Congress would muster a majority to stop him, especially when some of them, especially in his own party, will agree, because that's what he's doing.
Well, that's pretty striking. Okay, let's move a little more quickly to some of these other areas. How about the Fed? Since you and I talked a bit about that off camera. I don't know. People complain about the Fed, then they don't do much about the Fed, or they do. Or in the real world, would Fed policy, Fed governance be very different under Trump than under Harris, do you think?
I think for the Fed, you're talking more about a lower probability than tariffs, but it could be an even worse thing longer term if that low probability event materialized. He yelled at the Fed in just ridiculous ways. I mean, tweeting that Powell, who's worse, President Xi or Jay Powell. I mean, it's just unbelievably appalling behavior. If I had to measure the consequence of that in terms of inflation or GDP, I can't really measure it for you. It probably isn't that huge. It's not something I would advise a president to do. I can't imagine the sign on it is positive, but I don't know the magnitude. The bigger issue is, does he try to fire Powell? He considered that in his first term and rejected it. He has said, if Powell does a good job, he'll keep them. He's had this sort of conditional statement about keeping him. It's not obvious what the Supreme Court would ultimately rule, and it certainly would be the one that ultimately decides whether or not this could happen. But even without it, Powell's term ends in 2026. And if he had a compliant Senate, he could appoint someone that is completely out of the mainstream of Volcker, Greenspan, Bernanke, Yellen, Powell that we've been, I think, very lucky to have for 25 years now. Now, I'm not positive what a completely non-mainstream chair could do. They'd still would have a lot of other governors that were sensible. They'd still have Reserve Bank presidents that were sensible. The Fed makes its decisions in a 12-person committee. So I think he actually couldn't really destroy the Fed in 4 years. But if he replaced 2 or 3 people on the Fed, and then his successor continued it up with 3 more, now all of a sudden you have a whole different animal. And in addition to his lack of respect for the Fed, if it's raising interest rates because his policies are inflationary and we have a big debt problem that's related to our interest payments, that'll give him a bunch of motive as well. So it's a hard thing to pull off quickly. It's also possible that the stock market will stop him from doing it and give him some pretty immediate negative feedback. Some of it does need to go, a lot of it does need to go through the Senate, unlike the tariff. So all of that is why I think it is a smaller chance that the terrible things happen in the Fed space. But if they do, this institution is protected much more by norms than laws, and norms can change.
Yeah, and I do think it's almost, isn't it less exactly what policies a different Fed chair or a different Fed board would follow, and more that the people he would put in would presumably be put in there to follow what policies Trump wanted, and not to resist him on things that are temporarily unpopular and so forth. And so the kind of overall politicization of monetary policy would be pretty striking. And I don't know, people say, Powell, you said could go to the Supreme Court. I take that point, but I don't know. If the president of the United States says, I have totally lost confidence in this Fed chairman, I want him to quit, I don't know, is Jerome Powell, as a matter of principle, not going to try to run the Fed with the president of the United States literally asking him to quit? It's also unclear if the courts would uphold the, quote, independence of the Fed, right, under kind of administrative law stuff. So I just feel like the degree of, I think you're right that it's not like the odds are somewhat lower, but the politicization could be pretty a little more rapid than it would seem by just counting the numbers of seats, I would say, on the Fed board that Trump would control, so to speak.
Yeah. No, I think those are all unknowns. Could Jay Powell decide he needs to be the hero that saves this institution, and he's going to stand up for its independence? There's a very strong culture of that among central bankers, but who knows? It's not something we've dealt with before.
And Congress, really, then if the Republicans were to control one house of Congress, I suppose you'd have real fights with the Fed in a way that has been muted in the past. I think it's fair to say. Yeah,
no, I think all that's right. And we can talk about Harris and the Fed for a second, but a second is all that's needed here. Joe Biden, I've been a critic of various things he's done macroeconomically. On the Fed, not a shred of criticism. He's appointed great people, like including Jay Powell, reappointed as chair, and he stood back while they raised interest rates an enormous amount and did nothing at all to try to undermine or restrain them. And I have every reason to expect Harris would do the same. She certainly has reiterated her belief in the independence of the Fed. So, the same type of Fed we've had from the end of Carter through the present day is the type of Fed we would have under her.
Spending, taxing, budget, the deficit that would result from the combination of spending and taxing.
Right.
Walk us through the sort of two fundamental policies choices
so you look at both of them. I think it would be fair to say neither one of them is overly preoccupied with the deficit and the debt right now. It's not something that comes up a lot in their speeches. It's not something that comes up a lot in the debate. And so if you're a fiscal hawk, this is a terrible election for you. And I think a lot of that is that the voters don't seem to care. And maybe why they don't care is interest rates are on the low side. And, I'm less worried about the deficit in some ways, but I think it's unsustainable. I think we do need to do something about it. I don't think we should make it worse, but I'm not panicked about it. So neither one of them is great on this. But quantitatively, there is a huge difference, a difference that you can measure in the trillions of dollars. And there have been a lot of different groups that have done comparisons of the full plan or parts of the plan. The most recent is the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. They said the Trump plan would cost about $7.5 trillion, and the Harris plan would cost about $3.5 trillion. There's various arguments you could make about those numbers. I would note for Trump, they gave him credit for trillions of dollars of tariff revenue, which I think is completely fair. Given our previous conversation, I would also give him credit for that. He has proposed it. But, does that materialize? Does that not? They had some numbers for Harris. I'm not entirely sure whether they should be counted against her. But regardless, trillions of dollars difference. You've seen similar differences in the Penn-Wharton budget model, in an analysis by an economist at the Yale Budget Lab, Tax Foundation, which is a conservative group. And part of it is that Donald Trump wants to extend all the tax cuts. And then every other day, it seems he has a new tax cut. Tax-free tips, which actually doesn't cost that much money. Tax-free Social Security, that's a lot. Tax-free overtime, that's an enormous amount. And I love reading the Wall Street Journal editorial page on these. Every one of them, they're sort of pulling their hair out because they're not your conventional pro-growth ideas, and nor are they your conventional progressive ideas. They're just, I don't know, improvised pander of some sort.
Yeah, it's as if no one had ever studied the unintended consequences, and written millions of articles in the last 50 years on if you do tax-free overtime, employees are going to shift their work to overtime. I mean, it's almost childish, some of it, right? I mean, there's legitimate debates on corporate tax rates and child tax credit and all that. Yeah. Those are policy issues. But some of that stuff Trump talks about is just, Harris has followed in one or two instances too, to be fair, but it's not real policy making,
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No. It's not like, yes, there's no one really in the policy community asking for any of these, and they're just really, really expensive. I think the overtime proposal could easily be $1 or $2 trillion, and that is without even taking into account the full extent of the adjustments that you were just talking about. So it's enormous, and what you want to do in tax policy as a general rule is have as broad a base as possible and as low a rate as possible. And this is the opposite, at least on the base. It's narrowing the base, which inevitably at some point will mean you have higher rates than you otherwise needed to have.
But of course, those are precisely the policy proposals that, in a way, people probably remember the most, and that there will be some political momentum if Trump were to win, for example, maybe a couple of cases also with Harris, to pass. I mean, I don't know, it's not going to be that easy for Trump to turn around and say, well, forget about that thing about no tax on tips. Now, as you say, that's a rather small number by these standards of big and small. But I don't know, does he just turn around and say, forget about that thing I said about Social Security? Plenty of people are going to say, no, you campaigned on that. And plenty of Republicans are going to say, hey, we talked about it and let's pass it. We're going to pass a giant tax bill. I guess the tax bill expires in 25. So some kind of tax bill is going to be on the agenda in 25, right? And we're going to do it without this. It's not that easy politically, I feel like, for them to explain that they're walking away from these irresponsible proposals,
Yeah. So there's a 2/3 chance that you have a Republican House and Senate if Donald Trump wins the presidency. So let's just start right there, that there's a decent chance. And, we see what happens when you have a Republican president, Republican Congress. They pass tax cuts. That's what they do. That's what Reagan did. That's what George W. Bush did. That's what Donald Trump did. Will they do every single one of the $7 or so trillion of tax cuts he's proposed? Probably not. If they do 5 of the 7, that's quite a lot. Now, even in divided government, though, right, as you just referenced, the tax cuts are expiring next year. Now, doesn't mean you need to pass a law. That law could just go away and the tax rates go back up. I actually think that wouldn't be so terrible. It's not my favorite choice, but it's not a terrible choice. This is the
2017 tax
the
package.
Individual tax cuts.
Yeah.
The individual tax cuts passed in 2017. Almost all of the individual ones expire in 2025. Almost all of the corporate ones that were passed are permanent. So they're not something that Congress needs to legislate. So anyway, Congress is legislating. You have Donald Trump as president. You have a Democratic Congress. And he goes to them and says, hey, here are the 8 things I want. A lot of them, the Democrats in Congress want. They want the tax cuts below $400,000. Maybe they like the idea of tax-free tips. Maybe they even like the idea of tax-free overtime. And then there's a few things they don't like for the business side. So what does Trump do? I'll give you a child tax credit if you give me those things. And imagining a deal that is the union of the priorities of the Democrats and Republicans in a Trump presidency, I don't think that's a totally crazy fantasy to have. So even divided government, I don't think will save us from a quite high bill in this regard.
Yeah, and if it is divided, it probably would be divided in the Democrats winning control of the House by a rather small margin, especially if Trump has won the presidency. They won't have been a very favorable, wind at their backs, but they could win the House by 5 or 8 seats or something. The idea, I don't know, Trump could also pick off 8 Democrats on something like You want to be the person who stands in the way of no tax on Social Security? You're going to go back and explain that in your district in Arizona or in Florida? I mean, I don't know. I feel like that was more like Reagan in 81, where he did get a lot of Democrats to support a tax package and giving them some stuff they wanted, but also politically bludgeoning them, really. So anyway, I think, people are probably underestimating, in a way, if Trump were to win, at least, the momentum for tax cuts.
And just to understand, I mean, it's also our macro position right now compared to 2017, and really, really different from 2001 when we had the Bush tax cuts. We have a much worse fiscal situation now than we had in 2001, and an even worse one in 2017. We have higher interest rates than we had in 2017. There's less scope for anything resembling fiscal stimulus. That wasn't really the rationale for them, but there was some fiscal stimulus provided by the 2017 tax cuts, but we're basically at full employment. So there's a lot of ways in which, and then, by the way, I should say on the corporate side, lowering the corporate rate from 35 was a good idea. Obama wanted to lower it to 28. I think 21 overshot the mark, but it needed to go in that direction, and it's good that it did. So, but that's just not where we are right now. None of these are tax cuts that need to happen. And the fiscal situation and macro situation are much less forgiving.
But of course, if Harris is president, let's just say there's a Republican Senate and a Democratic House, which is, I think, the most likely outcome of a Harris victory. You have some of the same dynamic there too, right? Where Republicans have some bargaining power, and the easiest bargain is to accept each other's tax cuts, not reject each other's tax cuts,
Yeah. Oh, I agree with that. I mean, there's this view that divided government will be good because it's stalemate. I don't think they quite understand the you get your thing and I get my thing, and we'll call it bipartisan dynamic that can be quite prevalent in Congress. So I think it is likely that either one of them will worsen our fiscal situation. But as I said at the beginning, if you look at the campaign plans, there's trillions of dollars of difference. If you look at probabilistically what's likely to happen conditional on them getting elected, I think there's also probably trillions of dollars of difference. But neither one of them, I think, is adequately focused on this. And just to be clear, I'm not super panicked about it, but I do think a Hippocratic oath of do no harm is the minimal thing to do when you're in a hole like we are now.
And any particular tax policy proposals that are interesting, notable, particularly good in terms of just actual policy as opposed to the macroeconomic numbers? I mean, child tax credit, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I like the child tax credit, but even there's two different parts of it. One is making it refundable, so it's available to low-income households. I think that's very high bang for the buck in terms of poverty reduction. And then there's a raise the value for everyone, which is a wonderful thing to do, except for the fact that it costs a huge amount and we can't, I don't think we can afford it. So even there, I think we unfortunately need to be targeted unless we want to raise some other tax on people. And then, by the way, you're giving with one hand, taking back on the other with the other. So what's the point?
And if finally, maybe on taxes, if Harris were to get something resembling her proposal, which is, I think, no tax increases for families under 400,000, but some increase in rates for the wealthy, and Trump were to get his proposal, how different distributionally are they? I mean, it's rhetorically, they can make them sound very different, but are we talking about a huge difference in tax policy, or a sort of, kind of standard Republican Democratic kind of difference?
Yeah, I mean, within just the playing field of the extending the tax cuts, the difference is about $1.5 trillion. That's probably a standard Democratic difference. Under Trump, the top rate would be 37. Under Harris, the top rate would be 39.6. It's when you add in the other proposals that the difference widens, because Trump wants to extend all the tax cuts plus do a lot of new tax cuts. And Harris wants to extend most of the tax cuts, but not all of them. But then she wants some tax increases on the wealthy and some tax cuts for moderate income families. So if you look at the top rate under the Harris proposals all in, I believe it's 44.6%. And so now the difference between 37 and 45 is, it's a meaningful difference.
And that's kind of the real difference from a sort of point of view.
They could get everything they wanted. Now, for Harris to get something like that, she would definitely need a Democratic House and Senate. And even that might not be sufficient. A number of her tax proposals were ones that were in every Biden budget. And it's not like he got them done in his first 2 years. And sure, we don't have Manchin and Sinema now, but if she has 50 senators, um,
Well, some of those
she'll be able to get some tax increases, but I don't think she'll be able to get the bulk of the ones she's proposed.
Yeah, that's interesting. And some of those Democratic senators do come from New York and California and other states that have quite a lot of taxpayer voters for them who maybe are okay with a bit of a tax increase if they're well off, but maybe not, as you say, the 7% hike from 37 to 44 or whatever. So yeah, I wonder. Yep. That's interesting. Yeah. Anything else on spending, taxes, deficit debt?
One thing that they haven't
worried?
How much? It's a reality. Is our defense spending has been falling, relative to our economy for 30 years now, and that's going to have to go in the other direction over the next decade. They both sort of rhetorically say things about it. It's not a big campaign issue, but when you think of what's going to actually happen when a president sits down in the Oval Office next year, part of it is going to be figuring out how we can scale up our defense capabilities. And part of the answer to that is more money.
And I very much agree with that. And so how worried are you that either one gets in, they pass the deficit increases some, as you say, it's not panicking right now maybe, but debt is at about, I think, close to a post-World War II high in terms of comparison with GDP. I mean, is it 2026, 2027? Do we begin to get a real kind of debt crisis or debt scare or interest rate problems or cost of financing the debt starts to really become an even bigger chunk of the federal deficit? I mean, how much is that a real concern and how much is that a kind of 20-year thing or something?
Right. I mean, there's known knowns. You can model if the deficit goes up this much, how much is that draining capital? How much does that raise interest rates? How much does that slow investment? And all of that is concerning, but it's concerning in a very linear, grows over time. You wouldn't notice it in a huge way type of way. I think it's probably justification enough to do something about this, but it's not, wouldn't induce panic in anyone. But then there's the unknowns, and it's just really hard. Argentina has had a huge fiscal crisis at debt of 45% of GDP. Japan has had, measured properly, probably about 150% of GDP, 175% with no crisis at all. And so, I think the United States is more like Japan than it is like Argentina, but you never know. I mean, the UK had a mini crisis last summer under Prime Minister Truss, in part because of fears about irresponsible fiscal policies. And it basically came from nowhere. Some of it was a weird set of interactions around the insurance market and the like in the UK, but some of it was just a generalized psychological, she's proposing this tax cut. What if she proposed for 7 more? What if we're in a whole new paradigm? What if we've lost all responsibility? So these things can happen in weird types of ways. And, the question is, do we want to run an experiment on ourselves?
But it sounds like you think we're going to leave ourselves somewhat more vulnerable to that kind of shock 18 months from now than we are today. I mean, just
if the next president asked me, I would say, don't put all your effort into a grand bargain. Don't try to get everyone to Andrews Air Force Base. Come out with a big plan like George H.W. Bush did in 1990 on a bipartisan basis, and Bill Clinton did on a single party basis in 93. I would say that we're not at the stage where you need to do that. We're, though, at the do no harm stage and the try to get small wins for the deficit. So everything you do should make the deficit a little bit better rather than making it worse. And for me, that's the right way to straddle we're in an unsustainable place. It's not incredibly pressing in terms of interest rates. And, we're going to learn more about our fiscal capacity, the outlooks for interest rates and growth, et cetera, as we go forward. So it's a do no harm and do a little bit of good.
It sounds like
that's not where they are.
That's what I say. They're in a do a little bit of harm, but not too much harm kind of place. Is that right? I mean, yeah.
Well, I would say Trump would be a medium amount of harm, and Harris would be a smaller amount of harm.
Okay, that's good. Housing has been talked about probably more than a lot of these issues on the campaign trail, especially by Vice President Harris. Say a word about, can the federal government really affect this, apart from interest rates, presumably? I mean, and should they? Is this a real policy, or is this an attempt to cheer up people who are having trouble, paying for their first house or whatever.
I'm a YIMBY enthusiast. I think supply is a big part of it, and deregulation of all the rules that get in the way of supply is a big part of it. But you said, is it a federal thing? Those rules are at the state and local level. Harris has been saying all the right things on that. I think the bully pulpit matters. I have worked with people on our city council here in Cambridge who are going to pass, I hope, a very big reform that makes it much easier to build housing in Cambridge. And they have been inspired by a lot of the national discussions around this. So I think her using the bully pulpit matters. She's also proposed $40 billion in grants to create incentives for states and localities that want to take things like this up, and money can do a decent amount too. So that's what I'm most excited about in the Harris plan. She then has a lot of tax credits for first-time home buyers, things like that. For me, those are mostly expensive, complicated. Some of them will increase demand, so they'll drive up the price of housing. So I'm not such a fan of those. On the Trump side, to be honest, I've only heard one thing, which is if we can throw all the immigrants out, we'll lower house prices. And there's a tiny bit of truth to that, but it's tiny. The economic research does find that immigrants raise house prices, but only by a small amount. Most of what we've seen, most of what people don't like over the last 5 years has nothing to do with immigrants. And that's especially true for things like middle-class house prices, where the type of immigrants that people have been concerned about aren't buying those same types of houses. In fact, in many cases, they're actually working on building or repairing those types of houses. So I've only heard this immigration, which for Trump is immigration and tariffs seem like the two panaceas to all of our problems. And I can assure you, neither of them will do much of anything for the housing
I'll let you
problem.
go in a minute, but let's just say a word about immigration, because that is so important. And as you say, it's the other thing Trump seems to really care about. And J.D. Vance went on about the immigrants driving up house prices. If they did in Springfield, Ohio, incidentally, am I wrong to say this? That it's because they probably improved the economy of Springfield, Ohio, and there were more people working. And if house prices going up was not an unambiguously bad thing, a lot of people who were preceded the recent Haitians to Springfield was living in houses whose value for the first time probably in 30, 40 years, given the economics of that area, was starting to go up. So, I mean, it's so demagogic, I think, to sort of pretend that the kind of housing price problem that people are concerned about is affected by Haitians coming to work in Springfield, Ohio,
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. But on immigration more broadly, we're in a place in the United States right now where if all we had was our native-born workforce, we would have shrinking employment. Every month you would wake up and you would get the jobs number, and it would be a negative number. And that wouldn't even be because you're in recession. That would just be because some people were getting older and retiring, and the fertility rate is below 2 or below 2.2, in fact. So you're below the replacement rate that you need. So the only reason that we're not Japan, that we have a growing workforce, is because of immigrants. Now, I don't think it's great that we've created an economic system that basically can't function without undocumented immigrants. I would much rather that we have a lawful system that expands legal immigration. As part of that expansion, you could weight it more heavily towards a points type system based on skill-based immigration. But I think there's a lot of room for a lot of different types. And then at the same time, you can tighten up the border. That was basically what George Bush was trying to do. That's what Barack Obama was trying to do. That's what Paul Ryan was trying to do. So, but it's not something Harris seems to want to go near. She talks more about the tightening up the border, and I totally get why. And then Donald Trump not only wants to tighten up the border, he wants to expel a lot of people in this country, which I think would be both inhumane and he's not going to have very good jobs numbers when he does that. He's not going to be happy about that. And finally, there's some Republicans who have this wishful thinking that he wants to expand legal immigration. That's not the rhetoric that I'm hearing from him. Springfield, those are legal immigrants. When he was president, he supported legislation, I think it's called the RAISE Act, that would have cut legal immigration, I believe, in half. So, with Donald Trump, who knows? But boy, would I place more chips on him reducing legal immigration than increasing it.
And I guess there's a fair amount of presidential discretion there too, right? So it's he could do certain things that would reduce immigration, not just border crossings, but actual immigration.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a decent amount. And part of it's the same reason as tariffs, which is the courts historically have given a lot of latitude to the president around issues that are the president asserts are national security.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I'm curious, just kind of closing thoughts on how we should think about these two policies going forward. But I am struck just, I mean, it's funny, immigration and tariffs seem like the two big, they're not traditionally in the top tier. You know, I wouldn't say if you had a normal discussion about economic policy before up to the next president, it would be so spending and taxes focused. But it sounds like these two, immigration and tariffs, could be the biggest actual, have the biggest actual real world effect. I mean, I guess Harris on immigration. What do you think? That's also more of the same, or less of more of the same.
Less of the same. Less of the same
as Biden. I mean,
yeah.
I wonder if she won, if she would have some ability to increase some non-border crossing types of legal immigration, if I can put it that way. You know, some of the kind of, I mean, just make it be more generous in terms of.
I don't have a great feel for the legislative dynamic in that space, and it's possible there's some positive scenario there, but it's been such a traumatic issue for Democrats politically that, and then there's way less Republican cooperation on it than there was when Obama was trying to do it, and there wasn't enough cooperation back then, even though the Speaker of the House would have loved to have done it. So I am pessimistic.
Yeah, no, unfortunately, that sounds right, though. It is kind of astonishing that, I don't know, it's just, I mean, I suppose one could argue that Democrats I think Harris honestly had to go into a defensive posture on immigration, which has probably helped her in the campaign, but no one making the case for the benefits of immigration. It's like with trade, too, right? When Hillary Clinton abandoned TPP, it does have an effect over it makes things more politically. Something is politically difficult, you make it politically impossible by no one holding up the other side of the argument for a period of years, really. I mean,
look, every time she touts the jobs number or the growth number, she is talking about the benefits of immigration. We would not have those numbers without immigration. But obviously, that's not a link that she makes explicitly.
The deportation thing, just one more word on that, is so astonishing. But again, he's gone pretty far in talking about it, as has Vance. I don't think they can just become president and vice president on January 20th of 2025 and say, well, forget about all that deportation stuff. Now they don't have to do 15 million, and they don't have to do the true kind of insanity and chaos and inhumanity that would create. But I don't know. They can't do nothing, I think. So I think that's a little underestimated as a thing that would happen in the early months of a Trump presidency.
You may well be right.
I don't know. No. Final thoughts? I mean, what should people... Look,
I mean, we haven't talked about the state of the macroeconomy. I actually don't think that's a big thing that voters should vote on. An awful lot has to do with the Fed. An awful lot has to do with luck. Presidents always get too much credit when it's good, too much blame when it's bad. But boy, is it good right now. 3% growth. The unemployment rate's come down for the last 2 months and remains just a bit above its 50-year low. The rest of the world is incredibly envious of where the United States is macroeconomically. Inflation has come down a lot. Again, I don't think a rational person should go out and vote for Harris because of that. But I think it'd be pretty irrational to decide, you didn't want to vote for Harris because the United States was currently in a recession.
But since 70% of people are unhappy with the economy, and this is where the do no harm is a hard sell in a 70% wrong track environment, right? I mean, people want change, and she's had to straddle that, being the candidate of change. And as you say, but basically, really on most of these policy areas, the candidate of not too much change or not too much bad change.
Yeah, that I agree.
It's a tricky thing to do politically, actually, and Trump hasn't paid much price for sort of rather proposing very risky changes in an environment, as you say, where normally if you came down from Mars and they said, okay, 3% inflation coming back down, 3% on 4% unemployment, 2% real wage growth, something like that, voters might want to just not risk this. But maybe that argument is kicking it a little bit here at the end for Harris. I can't tell, but it hasn't been prominent, I would say, in the campaign. But the voter, the perceptions being this different from quote reality is pretty striking. Maybe we can close on that. Does that not strike you as a student of political economy?
And we've discussed that before on your podcast, and we could spend another hour on it.
We would.
Now, and that's what I was saying. As I was saying, I would not go vote for Harris because GDP growth is 3%. But definitely don't not vote for Harris because you think GDP growth is minus 3%, because, by the way, it's not minus 3%. And by the way, real wages are rising right now, et cetera, et cetera.
That's a good hard-headed economic attitude to end with. So, Jason, thank you very much for joining me again. Really an interesting and thought-provoking conversation.
Great talking to you, and I guess I'll see you on the other side of the election.
Yeah, we'll have to have a conversation then about whichever new president is doing whatever things we didn't expect or do to discuss today. Thanks, Jason, and thank you all for joining us on Conversations. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more like it, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Your interest in this program means a lot to me. I appreciate it.